Welcome. My name is Gail, and welcome to being a Messianic Jew. And today we are looking at the life and times of Jesus. And why is this important? Because this discussion we look at the life and times and the roots of the Hebrew faith and how that applies to us as Christians as well. And today, like I said, we're going to be looking at the life of Jesus and what we know from scriptures about him and what it would have been like for a person in his time. And that helps us to put it into context. And that's why we're doing that. So let's get started on this journey. So we know from Matthew chapter 1 that Jesus had a family and he was a descendant of David and he was part of the Jewish community. We know in Matthew chapter 2, the wise men even came and worshiped him. But that wasn't just normal daily life. He didn't have people coming and worshiping him every day as a kid. What was his life like as a Jew at the time? And what would have been like growing up in the community? What would have been like living as an adult, mainly as an adult in that time frame? And what do the scriptures tell us about Jesus as a person? So what was it like for a man of Jewish faith at the time? And we're going to touch a little on his personality that we can tell from scripture. So we want to think of Jesus, we tend to think of him as, we should think of him as God. But he actually came to earth and he actually suffered and he stubbed his toe, I'm sure, and he lived a normal life of the time. And how did those things affect him and how was the life like? Was it a difficult time? And yes, it was a very unusual time in history. Many historians call this a powder keg time. And we're going to get into why that is. But this was a very unusual time. And I know that Pastor Rebecca Lynn has talked about that there were that the enemy sent so many prophets during that time, and it confused people. So what did that mean in his ministry? What did those things happen? So we're going to be looking at that. And we're going to look at the daily reality of first century Judea. So remember that when you read the Gospels, they're not like a biography in the modern sense. They don't offer us his height, the eye color, his childhood hobbies. But if you dive into them, there is a pretty significant, rich set of snapshots that reveal his humanity. And we know from historians and archaeologists some of the things that happened and they did in their daily lives. So that's why we're looking at that. So to understand Jesus as a person, we got to look at the world he lived in. So what was that like? We know that his social status, he was a tecton. So we're going to go into that a little bit more, but many people think of that as a carpenter, but that may not actually be correct. It may not just been a carpenter. And this firmly placed him in a working class. So he would have had calluses on his hands. His father would have been a hard worker. Joseph was a hard worker and provided for his family. There was physical labor, and there was his father experienced the anxiety of living under the thumb of the Roman Empire, and there were a lot of taxes. They would have been practicing Jews. We know that because his cousin, John's father and mother both had been in the temple. His father was a priest. John's father was a priest, so his own cousin's father was a priest. So we know he was attending, and we know from different scriptures that he attended synagogue. He participated in the festivals. We know that from scriptures. And he obviously was, from the scriptures, deeply versed in the scriptures. He knew the Torah. He knew the Sabbath. He also knew the people's hope for liberation. And then he had the daily grind. We're going to talk about how much he walked. Jesus walked a lot. He traveled a lot. And we're going to look at his daily food. So think about this as a social world. It would have been a small community. They lived in villages, little towns, and it was a face-to-face. They were very different than we are today, where we're a global community. They were very face-to-face. And that's why we've talked in the past about if a person did something and they got kicked out of their local synagogue, that was huge because that was the big thing in the community that you did. So it was very important of the social standing in your small town. And any of you that have ever lived in a small town understand how the dynamics of that can work. But this was even more so because it was also their faith. So there was a lot going on there with Jesus's life. And we know from John chapter 1 that in the beginning was the Word was God, and the Word was God. And we know that he was he was with God in the beginning, and through all things were made, and nothing was made that has without him, nothing that has been made. In him was the life. So we know that he was the life. We know that he is the part of the Godhead. So as we look at the daily aspects, keep in mind that Jesus was a unique human when he came here. He was already the Word. He was already part of the Trinity. He was already God. So part of the Godhead. So we know that he was the Son. So while we can talk about the different aspects of him, we can also see that there's so much more to Jesus than anyone else. So let's kind of look at that, and we're going to look at his the context. So again, like I said, he was a worker, he had religious practice and the daily grind. So there was a lot of that going on. But let's look at his personality. So we know from some scriptures that there are some different things about him. He definitely was human. And when you strip away some of the aspects that we look at as Christians, where we have this picture on the cross, we have a stained glass, he had a very distinct personality too. He wasn't passive. He was intense, relational, and at times for the people around him, it was unpredictable because he was following the Lord's will and he was doing what God told him to do. So it could be unpredictable. He had a very sharp, biting wit. I've always said that God has a sense of humor, and Jesus definitely had a sense of humor. He had a little bit of irony, a master of irony and hyperbole. He would talk about getting a log out of your own eye before getting a speck out of someone else. He uses this sharp, almost to us, it's comedic. I don't know if it was to them, imagery to make a point. So he was quick with a retort whenever the religious authorities would come back to him. He immediately had an answer for them. Now, there are times, of course, when he didn't speak in this because there was a reason for that. And because of his role and his mission, he was a boundary breaker. He repeatedly put himself in social situations that were scandalous for a man of his time. So a man of his time would, as I said, it was so important in the community. He was eating with the tax collectors. He was engaging in long theological conversations with a Samaritan woman, which was a double taboo because he was talking to a woman and he wasn't married to her, and this was a Samaritan, so that was a big deal there. And he touched and healed those that were unclean. So he had a personality that was deeply comfortable with people, and he wasn't afraid of the social stigma. He was able to go out and touch people. But yet he had the full spectrum of human emotions. We know that he wept openly at the tomb of his friend Lazarus in John 11. He was frustrated at times by his own disciples. We know that from Mark 9. Sometimes there was times where he would be very frustrated with things that people weren't getting it. And he's like, how long have you been with me? We also know that there was the anger when he saw the vulnerable being exploited from Mark chapter 11. And he craved solitude. And I'm not sure if, I know that he needed to recharge sometimes, and he was always on point. And was it a recharging to go and pray always, or did he also crave solitude? I'm not 100% sure about that, but we know that he went off by himself to pray to God. We know that. He repeatedly withdrew to lonely places to play or to recharge, is what it kind of talks about. So he might have been more of an introvert at heart, but who needed that time. But I think the most important thing is he needed the time to talk to God. He needed that time to go with the Lord. So as we look at this, remember the Gospels are not written, remember, they're testimonials. So people are telling their story, what they saw. They aren't meant to give us a whole psychological profile, but like I said, you can kind of see from them, you get a little tiny glimpse into a person who was deeply grounded. He was physically active, we know because of the walking. He was socially provocative and possessed a quiet intensity that just drew people in. So if you had met him on the street, he would have been someone that everybody wanted to meet and talk to. And whether you agreed with him at the time or not, you wanted to hear him. He had that kind of personality, and we know that's because he was God. But we know that he drew large crowds because of his speaking. So I talked about a sexton. So the thing about it is the word implies mastercraft. Many people translate it to carpenter. Well, where he lived, wood was kind of scarce, so it may have not been a carpenter as such. The word also applies to a stonemason, applies to woodworking, metalworking. It applies to different things. So he would have been the general contractor or a handyman about the village kind of thing. That's what they would have done. So like if somebody's farming tool or whatever broke, he was going to be the one to fix it. He and his family would have been the ones to do that. So he would definitely was a general laborer, which actually put him in a great position because he was able to relate to the fishermen and all of the other people of the time. He was able to relate to them because of that. So what did a typical day, and I don't know what his typical day looked like, but what was the typical day of a worker? So we know they worked from sunrise to sunset. They began at the first light to avoid pushing the midday heat. It was very hot in the afternoon. So at a lot of times in the culture, they would take naps in the afternoon or calm down or go inside where it was cooler. The other thing is just a few miles from Nazareth, and this is a part of the picture is part of the ruins there. It was a major city. We know that there was, in his time frame, because of other historians and the archaeology, that there was a massive Roman-led reconstruction during that period. And it's very possible that his father went there to work. And maybe as he got a little bit older, he took him there because it went on for years. So we do know that there was a big project going on in a nearby city. What did they eat? Well, their midday meal would have been very humble, likely olives, bread, maybe fish, or a piece of fruit. Oh, and what do we hear on the mount? And we have what do they have? People have? They had bread and fish. That would have been what he would have been eating every day. As he was in the working class, he wasn't a beggar, but he wasn't rich. So he was definitely not one of the elite. He would have lived in the same village as most of his clients, and so his family's reputation would have been very valuable. So if a yoke broke 3 days after you fixed it, the whole village is going to know, and they hold it against you. Because remember, it's a very tight community. So they would have known, and they would have known whether or not Joseph, his father, was a good man. They would have known those things. It's a small community. So what are some of the tools they carried? One of the biggest is they would have had an adze. So it's the primary tool for shaping wood. It is, I put a picture of one here, that heavy blade set at an angle to handle flattening and surfaces. Just like we use now, they use a plumb line, which is just a simple weight on a string to ensure things are straight. They had chisels and saws that they used, and they didn't use nails, because they were expensive and hand forged, so they used miters where they would put the pieces of wood together and join them up. So they had to actually be really good at that in order to make them work well together. Having come from a family and having probably done this work himself from the sounds of it, being a daily laborer would have shaped the way he spoke and thought, and we can see that in scriptures. He did use construction metaphors. He talks about a house built on rocks versus sand. He isn't using just a poetic cliche. He's speaking as someone who understood how those things worked. When he's talked about yoke, a farmer's yoke had to be custom fitted to an animal's neck or it would chafe and cause injury. And he knew this because he knew what a yoke was because he would have been making them. A yoke made easy. So he's drawing on his deep professional understanding of something that's meant to fit perfectly and reduce the strain of the work on the animal. So he was deeply grounded. It wasn't the life of just a scholar of philosophical musing, sitting in an ivy tower. It was the life of blistered hands, the archaeological problem solving, the daily friction of working with people who were often tired, frustrated, and struggling to get by. He was in those communities. God put him in a place where he was with the common people so he could understand what they were going through. So then I started thinking about the time and the way they lived in. And I started thinking about the opposition of this and a correlation that I came up with. Because my husband was watching this recently on a show, and it really struck with me. During the occupation of Holland, people would snitch, and there was a lot of oppression. And so I started looking at the oppression and the mechanism of the 20th century surveillance. And how did that look from the Nazi occupation at the time of Holland and how that worked in also the first century. So how does that work? What is the dynamics of it? Think about if you lived in a country, or it's possible you do. You live in a country where there's occupiers to the land. So if you lived in Galilee in Jesus' time, you lived in a world where your neighbor's word could potentially be your undoing. You could have a snitch, just as we saw in Nazi Germany and Nazi Holland, and we've seen it in other countries as well. So we had to think about the dynamics of the oppression. So just like any other territories in history, the Romans had a mixture of direct military force and indirect local collaboration. And in this case, for Jesus, it was the church the temple, and the priests and the Sadducees, the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they also worked with the Romans. So keep that in mind, that you have your own church working with them, or your own religious faith. So while Rome didn't have the technology we do today, they were masters at gathering intelligence. They relied on the local informants and administrators to remain the Roman peace. If you were a local troublemaker, or agitator, or part of an insurgent group, you were definitely being watched. There were people ready. Well, and then even the tax collector. We know Matthew was a tax collector. Why did they hate the tax collector so much? Well, think about like in Nazi in the Netherlands, the snitch was often a neighbor seeking profit or favors. In Jesus' time, it was the tax collector that held this similar function. They were Jews who effectively sold out to the Roman machine. They extracted their wealth from their own people to fund their occupying power. They skim off the top to enrich themselves. They lived well. Tax collectors lived very well because they were skimming a little bit off the top. And because they were backed by the Roman soldiers, they were untouchable. Nobody could touch them. The local law, even though they knew they were doing it, they couldn't do anything about it. They made them the ultimate symbols of greed and betrayal. And that's why it was such a big deal, and why it was so hard for them, the disciples, to trust Matthew at first, because of what he'd been doing. This was a sign of moral or national treason to many of them. And so when Jesus would have dinner in a tax collector's home, it's like, what are you doing? You're going to the dark side. You're going to the bad people. You know, that's what they were thinking at the time when they saw this. And there was the cost of dissent. So there we know Romans did a lot of public executions. They have their primary tool for psychological warfare. They would do the slow public, not just the cross, but they did many different kinds of slow public, humiliating, brutal, don't do this warnings. And we know that even when they would take people even to the Colosseum and have them tortured and die there. So we know that this was a very tough time to live in. So what about the snitches? Well, like I said, there was a big incentive to maintain the status quo. The temple needed to keep Rome happy to retain their power. In the past, we've talked about how much money the temple was bringing in. It'd be millions, possibly billions of dollars a year into the temple in our modern times. That's how much it would be. So we're talking a large amount of money, and it would motivate them to totally keep everybody in line, to keep the other Jews in line, to keep the common people in line. And keep in mind, you had different groups with different ideas on how to deal with this. Some wanted to fight the Zealots, and then some wanted to draw into the wilderness the Essenes, and then you had some who just cooperated with the Romans, the Sadducees. So you had different sects that were all trying to do different ways of dealing with this. So while I used the Nazi Netherlands as an example, you have to think it's similar, but the nature of oppression was a little bit different, because Holland was done by a radicalized extremist ideology. They were looking to purge mainly Jews and other people out, but Rome, they were a superpower. They were a superpower government. They didn't care who you were. You had to come along. They wanted your taxes. They wanted your submission. As we have talked about in the past, they actually built one of their army barracks right at the temple so that they could keep track of all of the money and everything going in and out of there. They couldn't go into the temple. They couldn't go into the courtyard, but they could keep a very close eye on it, and which they did. So when you look at this, to the people at the time, they were looking, any of these people were trying to keep everything oppressed. So when you look at the Gospels with this lens, Jesus' behavior becomes even more radical to them. He called Matthew a tax collector to follow him. That wasn't just a kind act. That was a massive inflammatory social statement to them. They would have been horrified that he was doing this. Who are you to bring him? So he was essentially pulling a high-ranking collaborator of the system and integrating him into a movement that was ultimately aimed at completely type of kingdom. Keep in mind that many people thought Jesus was there to go and get rid of the Roman occupation. That's not what he was there for. But they didn't know this. So this put Jesus in the crosshair of the Roman authorities and the local religious elites. They were all terrified of anything that smelled like sedition or organized revolt, and that's why they were so worried about him. So kind of gives you an idea of where this comes from. And many people call this a powder keg time, and we're going to go more into that. But there was a double oppression in his time. Most people were not literate, and they had to go to this temple or the synagogues in their community to learn about God and to hear the scriptures, so hear the Torah. So that's kind of, that was difficult in its fact, because they weren't always knowledgeable, nor did they have access to the Torah to read it on their own. So you have this complex web where people at the top were often seen as the ones enforcing the status quo, which is we talked about the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Then you have all of this massive taxes and all of this other oppression that's going on at the same time. So it's a lot going on. There was a tax burden. There was actually triple taxes. You had the Roman tax, we had the temple tax, and then you had your local family obligations to support your local economy. So then you had the sacrificial economy. So every year, remember, there were specific animals that you had to do in specific coins. You had to use a shekel. And there were many things that you had to do every year. And for a poor farmer, these costs to petition their own religion were set by an elite group that they had no control over. They couldn't say, hey, I can't afford this. This is something they had no control over. So collaboration and survival, many people did turn other people over for money. The reality was very systematic sometimes. The Sadducees, the priestly group who ran the temple, were essentially the management team for the Roman interests in Judea. They maintained their power by ensuring peace. Anyone or anything that threatened to stir up a riot or draw Roman military attention was a threat to them. So turning a very popular, provocative teacher like Jesus over to Roman wasn't just about money. To them, they were thinking of it as self-preservation. They viewed him as someone who would bring the Roman hammer down on their city. So we have the scripture where it's better for one man to die. And this is why they actually viewed it that way. We know this from scriptures. Keep in mind that only 3 to 10% of the entire male population would have been literate. Very unlikely, very many females were literate. So this gave them, if you can't read and you couldn't interpret the Torah yourself, you were totally dependent upon the scribes and the Pharisees, who we already know were putting more and more laws into place, more and more laws. We have 313 mitzvot, laws that came from the 10 Commandments. So we know that these were all being put in place, and they became more and more, they kept getting more and more confined. But these are people that are struggling to make a living and struggling to get by that are already getting this. So now you've got these people there, they want somebody to come and take over. And we know that there are other people that did try to revolt. So Jesus, his teaching was so jarring to them, he didn't just quote the elite interpretations, he bypassed them entirely. He went back to the fundamental principles of the law, like mercy, justice, and faith. And he often taught in parables, as we know, which were oral stories, not like the written code that people were hearing, but he made the deepest wisdom of his tradition accessible to people who never had touched a scroll in their lives. So this was something that was very different of the time. So I talked about that there were definite snitches. And so if you were a poor illiterate laborer in Galilee, you had all of this pressure on you, and you had all these temple authorities that you were being told you needed to make sure your neighbors and you were doing it right. So when Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God, he wasn't talking about heaven. He was painting a picture of the he was talking about how there were these gatekeepers sometimes. Many times he would be talking about how the Pharisees and Sadducees were handling this. So he was actually talking about this, and he talks about what will happen later on, about the first would be last. So this was something completely different. And when we look at this, you have a snitch. We had a snitch in his own group. And this person turned him over to the authorities. In that time frame, that wasn't that unusual that you would have somebody that would snitch someone out. So while it's horrifying and it's terrible what Judas did, many people probably wouldn't have been surprised, and it wouldn't have been something that was coming as a shock that it happened, which is a horrible thing to say, but it's very sad it wouldn't have been as surprising as it is to us. So why did Jesus talk in parables? And these were they were often rhetorical weapons. As a man who was spending his life building structures and watching how they held up in pressure, he used this vocabulary to dismantle the social and religious structures of a time. So he took these rigid hierarchies, the economic extraction, the religious gatekeeping, and inverted them. He flipped them over totally. So when we see in Luke chapter 20, when he's talking about the wicked tenants, he is telling the temple authorities that they're not the owners of the religious life. They're merely the tenants who've betrayed the owner who is God. So he used his own language of construction and land management so he can explain this to the people. Then when you go to the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, this is in a society where everything was pure and you wouldn't touch the people that had leprosy, or you wouldn't go near anything. You had to keep pure all the time. And you also didn't go near people. So that's why it was such a taboo for him to talk to the Samaritan woman. You did not go where these people. So in this parable, you have a priest, a Levite, pass by the dying man, but then you have a social outcast who is the wrong kind of person that stops to help. So which one did the right thing? And then the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18. So you have two men going to the temple to pray. One is a Pharisee, which is the highest level and the gold standard. And he's listing his accomplishments as he's reading his chest where people can see it. And then you have a tax collector who's standing on the street corner who really is saying, I sinned. What is the difference here? So that is where he's trying to show the same things that they would see every day in their lives, and he used those as great stories to teach them. So when you put them all together, why did he make the authorities so nervous? Because he wasn't preaching about being nice and doing what they told. He was delegitimizing the temple authority. He was telling the public that these gatekeepers were failing. He was identifying the neighbor. He was expanding the concept of the community to the very people the current system excluded, like the tax collector, the poor, the Samaritans, the widow, all of those people. He was including people that the temple did not include. And he threatened the economic status quo. He prioritized mercy over the sacrificial system. So he's undermining this business machine that both Rome and the temple authorities wanted in place. There was a lot of money being made there, and he was undermining this. To the elite who managed the system, this wasn't just a teaching. It was just a dismantling of everything that they stood for. So he was building a new structure in the minds of the people, one that didn't need all of this scaffolding of all of the things that they're telling them that they needed. So this undermined the business of the temple. And then Romans would have noticed that too. They would have noticed this. So I mentioned the word powder keg, and historians often refer to this as a powder keg time. There's the comments that there was a rabble-rouser or a prophet on every corner. There were a lot of prophets in this time, and there were people that were doing it. There's some main ones we know. There are many of them. There were a lot of them. So if if you were in leadership and you were trying to control this, these people would have been people you would have noticed and people you want to get rid of. So some of them include the Thaddeus, who was a prophet and led a crowd to the Jordan River. He was promising he was going to part the waters. And the Roman governor sent the cavalry to slaughter them. We know that there was a person, we know him as the Egyptian, who led people to the Mount of Olives, promising the walls of Jerusalem would fall at his command. And again, the Romans took care of that and stopped them. And then we have Judas of Galilee. He led a revolt, and we also have the Barcoat revolt. We have many other revolts that were happening in those time frames. So there's a lot of them who, there were a lot of zealots who were trying to undermine the Roman authority and the temple authority. So this is why Jesus created such paranoia for them. So when their crowds are shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna, it's a cry for salvation, and he was being referred to as the King of the Jews, they didn't hear a spiritual sentiment. The leaders thought they heard a coup, and they were really worried about it for that reason. They misunderstood it. They didn't understand what he was doing. He wasn't stockpiling swords like many of the others were doing. He wasn't planning a military march, as we know. It wasn't a tactical threat. He was teaching people they didn't need the temple or the Roman sanctuary to have a direct transformative relationship with God. He was teaching them that you could have a relationship with God. So this, in many ways, was the most dangerous kind, because he couldn't just be killed with a spear like they had done the other ones I said. That was very scary for the religious elite of the time. So now we're going to go back and look a little bit about, well, what was the daily life like for these people? So the daily life, they traveled. So what was this disciples' life like? They traveled a lot. The lives of Jesus, their daily life, so they were moving around, they were doing itinerant circuit work, they were traveling in groups, usually. Remember, they were sent out by 2 by 2s at one point, but usually they were sent out in a group, and they were touching, healing, navigating the social friction. They lived off the hospitality of other people, which was a common practice in that time, but it left them very vulnerable, and it left them where they could be going from a town and maybe walk through a wheat field and try to grab some of the grain on the Sabbath. And it led to other things for them because they didn't have a stockpile with them. They weren't carrying a food truck. They weren't carrying things like that with them. You have to think about the physical toll on all of them. They were walking 10 miles a day in the heat with the barest essentials. Their food would have been very simple. They couldn't afford restaurants. Worst places, well, not restaurants like we think of, but there were places to eat sometimes, but they were just getting bread, fish, whatever they could get, they were eating. Fish would have been their primary protein. Often it was dried or salted for the road. They would eat lentils, chickpeas, olives, grapes, figs. We know Jesus cursed a fig tree, so we know they were eating things like that. And they did this as a communal meal. So when you have them on the mount where he gives out the loaves of bread and the fish, that wouldn't have been uncommon. They would have been doing that kind of thing on a regular basis, where they were sharing all of their food. I thought this was interesting. So I wanted to see, how far did Jesus travel? And for his 3 years of public ministry, we know he traveled 3,000 to 3,200 miles, because it's Capernaum, Jerusalem. He had to go to the festivals, missionary expeditions. His total lifetime, if you count Egypt and being a craftsman, then they bring it up to 10 to 15,000 miles. And when you think that many people would only go within 50 miles of their home, that's quite unusual. He actually was traveling a lot. And he was walking most of it. He did take a ship a couple of times, so we do know that he would do that. But most of this was walking. And so you have to think about put the numbers in perspective. The region of Galilee, where his ministry took place, is roughly very compact. It's about 50 miles wide and 150 miles long. But it would have been difficult going through this too. It's a rugged, hilly terrain, and even for short distances, it required a lot of physical endurance. So we do know that he did it. And then I went ahead and added, from scriptures, we know where he went on his final journey to Jerusalem. That was between 80 and 100 miles. So again, These were very difficult. And we know he had to take one of two paths because there's only two ways they could have done it at the time. And the Galilean pilgrims, they usually took the Jordan Valley route, and then there was the coastal route, but it was less likely because of the Hellenized nature of the coastal cities. They usually didn't go that direction. So, and remember, it took, they could walk about 15 to 20 miles per day. So this group would have been about that far. So just this journey from his last journey would have taken about 5 to 7 days. So it was, and also put it in context that the final leg of the journey from the Jordan Valley to Jerusalem was a significant elevation gain. So the city sits about 2,500 feet above sea level, so they would have had to walk up that. So there was a lot of things that they were doing, a lot of walking. So in a daily life, we know that Sabbath, boom, you have to stop. We know that. It's a hard stop. It's not just a day off. It was a requirement. So on that day, they couldn't have lit a fire. They couldn't have been traveling. They couldn't carry heavy burdens. So they were not traveling on the Sabbath. We do know that. And this is why their conflicts, so many of the Gospels conflicts happen on the Sabbath, because when they plucked grain or Jesus healed someone, they were violating very specific, as I said, the elite were putting in more and more rules, and they were violating those rules. Now, if you go back to the Torah, were they violating them? There's the big question, probably not. But if you go back to the very, very strong rules that were put in place, they were breaking those. And how did the disciples learn? They were doing by imitation. They would have learned conflict management, definitely. And they were learning prayer from Jesus. They were not a high-status group. They were a ragtag collection of fishermen, tax collectors, and laborers. Their daily life was often characterized probably by hunger, exhaustion from, I can't imagine walking that much every day myself, the constant fear of local authorities, the Roman soldiers catching up with their sedition of have their preaching. They were living on the margins of a society that was already living on the margins of an empire. So there's a lot going on there. And as I said, there was a lot of the Torah became weaponized by the elite. And the reason I say that is because think about this. If you have laws even today, is it possible and for like our Supreme Court to make laws that weaponize it against us? They take the writings of it but can change it a little bit. And maybe they change it to mean that man and woman are not just men and women, that there's a lot of different genders. You can see how you can change things slightly by the words. And that's what was happening. There was very strict things in the Torah, but then they actually would make it so you couldn't even rub grain together in their hands in Mark chapter 2. So you can see where this became a real big conflict between them. So there was a weaponization. And whenever Jesus was teaching, they would ask him by what the legislators would say. Keep in mind, they knew he had no formal rabbinic training, no pedigree from a great school of Hillel or any of the others. They knew that he was a day laborer, and they would ask him, by what authority do you do these things? We know this in Matthew 21:23. And they were highlighting his formal lack of credentials. They were signaling to the crowd. They were trying to say, he's a quack. He's an uneducated amateur who didn't understand the complexities of the law. So this was a classic credentialing attack that they would do on the masses to make them feel foolish for listening to him. But of course, he turned it back on to them. He would be able to turn it back. So again, these were more of the ones where he did this, and he would actually throw it back at them. So you have this in Mark 11, you have it in Matthew 21, where they were attacking him. So the authorities knew that this was an occupied territory, and fear is the easiest way for them to control it. And they used any violations that he was doing to build a case that he was a menace to the peace. They could define him as a threat to their religious identity, or worse, something that would provoke the Romans. That's how they were trying to attack him, and that's how they used it. They knew that they could attack him in that way. So then I mentioned the traveling to the temple. This traveling to the temple, it was something that was commanded. It was Passover, so there was different holidays that you had to do it. We know that all males from the Torah, they had to present at least 3 times a year for the major festivals: Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And while it was strictly mandated for the males, it was a little more flexible, because if you lived far away, you're struggling with poverty, maybe you weren't physically able to, you might make it only once a year. But when we read the scriptures about the time, think about all of the Jews are coming to one place, all over from the country. So it would have been a crazy time during that, a very packed time. The journey was going to be a multi-day, as I said. You would have to take, most Jews, it took 3 to 4 days of hard, dusty travel each way to get there. You traveled in a large caravan with your family. The people in your community would go together. There was a huge cost and economic burden to do this, and you couldn't appear empty-handed. You had to bring or purchase upon arrival animals for sacrifice. You had to have the pilgrim offering, you had to have the peace offering, and the festival offering. And because you couldn't carry it, that's why there was a big marketplace, and this is what Jesus was complaining about. You couldn't have carried all the things, and so you had the money changers, and you had these people there. So there was a lot of tension going on about this. And last week I talked about Purim, and the Jews at that time were living in the diaspora. So it would have been a little bit different, but you also had the snitches. You also had people that were doing it. So there's some, you can see the Jews have gone through this many times. There was always been these threats of people trying to kill them off and to put them into a box and trying to do this. So you have to consider that there has always been this problem as they go through it. But there is a lot of similarities, but there's a little bit of difference. And in Esther's time, she was in the elites, but in the Passover time, in Jesus' times, as I said, think about, I have a picture that was rendered of what it would have looked like. You would have people wall to wall in one little area. It would have been smashed in there. And this is the national identity, and the whole holiday of Passover is celebrating freedom, freedom of oppression. And so you have these people that are celebrating this. It would have been a very difficult time, and it would have been a holiday that would have probably made the Romans pretty nervous of what it means. So as I said, there's a big powder keg here, and both in Esther's time, because we saw that it was breaking up where she was going and saying, for such a time as this, she had to go to the king. Jesus, he also was in a powder keg. Every point there could have been a bad thing blowing up. Here in America right now, we're not living in a time that is like this. So sometimes it's hard to understand what it was like being oppressed. These people were very oppressed. So it's a very different time. And I kind of gone over Jesus, his reality. He lived in an occupied, and there was conflict. There was a lot of different things going on. So when you look at his life, it was a life of a laborer. He lived in a very dangerous political landscape, and his teaching was very different. It was something they never heard of. So he was a threat to those that maintained the power. But Jesus, we know that he cared. He had a personality. We know he had a wit, but he had a loving and giving personality, even from a human standpoint. Yes, he's God, but even from a human standpoint, his personality was different than a lot of people's. And he would have been somebody that people would have gravitated to and wanted to be around and wanted to see. What a great person, if you look at it from that. So we're to the end of that. And I picked the root word, and if you look at so this is the word for compassion or mercy. And this I thought it's not one of the more common root words. It's only used 40 times throughout the Old Testament. But when you think about it, it is a word that is so special because Jesus himself said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So you can see how Jesus was intentionally trying to move his followers away from the mechanical system of the temple and back to the womb-like heart of God. And I just thought this was a good root word for this today. But remember, as you do those, just look at the word and go backwards. And I also have it phonetically there for you. And remember, when you get to the that's a sound, kind of like you're coughing or something. It's not a real pretty sound, but that's what it is right there. For the food today, I picked what he would have been eating during the time, what they could have had. You could have had the white fish, you could have snapper, you could have any of these kinds of fish for you if you want to do it today. And they often had a lot of lentils. They might have had a little bit of onion, could have had some garlic. They definitely probably had some olives, and these are things that you could have had at the time, which would have made a very tasty dish. So that is what I have for the life of Jesus, and the reason we're doing that is because we're getting closer to Passover. So I think it's important to understand why this was such a powder keg at the time, and why it was so different, and why the things happened that did. What a time it was that he lived in. It was a very different time. And it's important to look at that as we put the scriptures in context, as we read them, and we read about Passover, and we read about these different things, so that we understand what it was like for them. It was a hard day's labor. They were working hard, and they were being oppressed at every turn. So I hope that helps, and I am going to open it up to comments and questions. Do any of the elders have any comments? Okay, does anybody have any questions? Okay, well, I did end up talking for a long time, so I hope that this was helpful. If you think of any questions or anything you'd like to know more about the life, was there any aspects that was different for anybody? Something you learned today that you didn't know about the life of the way they would have been living? Marion, you have your hand up.
Yes, Gail. Yeah, it kind of surprised me when you were explaining about the work he did. Like all this time, I've been hearing that he was a carpenter and all like that, but you breaking that down to actually what he did as a carpenter in that field of work is really good. You're looking like, oh, Jesus was a carpenter, so you think he's building houses and like a carpenter of today would. When back there it's like a totally different thing. And so, yeah, thank you for explaining that.
Well, you're welcome. So the thing about that is there could have been, especially in the city, in the bigger cities, there could have been people that specialized in something. Because, when you get into the bigger city and you're selling something in your booth and you're selling something, maybe you specialized in nice tables. Most people, remember, when we say tables, they would have been using something to prepare food, but most of the time when they're having dinner, they're sitting on the floor. So it's not quite the same as what we think of a dinner table. But they did have furniture. They did have furniture. So that is a little bit different. But you could have somebody who maybe was a well, not glass, but a pottery maker. So there were different people that had different specialties. So if you maybe you maybe you're really talented at making the columns, then you would have been specializing in that. So there were people that did specialize, but most of the time, these people, the people in the working class like that, did everything because they were the general contractors. They were the ones that fixed anything, and if you had a problem, they were the ones that had to figure it out for you. So that, and especially in a smaller town, that's what they would have needed rather than somebody who only made wood or may only did something. So there's a lot of difference in that area. So there are a lot of comments. Let me go back over here. The miles he traveled. Yeah, he kept going. They kept going every day. Learn there was the significance of how people looked at tax collector and why they were so harsh to them for Jesus hanging out with them. Yes, they would have not been favored because this were people that were making a profit. So not only were you getting taxed, so think about this, not only were you getting taxed, that they probably even overtaxed you so that they could skim more off the top because they weren't going to get caught skimming off of the Romans part of this money. They were going to skim off more, and like if the Romans said that you had to pay 2 shekels, they were going to get 3 shekels out of you so that they could keep one. So there would have been definitely, there would have been a hatred of them. I know that I've heard this from other writing. I've seen this from other writings. Very often the tax collectors, I don't know if they always did, but the Romans would actually go with them while they were working and protect them because the people might mob them otherwise and steal the money back. So Rome had a very, very good interest in these, and they often picked people. Well, they had to pick somebody who was at least educated, that could count and could keep track of the money for them. So the person would have been educated. And this would have been somebody that should have been going to the temple in the people's eyes, but instead were making money off of them and helping Rome. So, yeah. Okay. And understanding the Lord's living context, explain what was going on, why they taught the way he did, and why they rejected his teaching. So, yes, I would agree with that. And that's why I felt led to do this, was to put it into context. Whenever you read the scripture, I think it's very important to always look at who were they talking to at the time, who is this meant for, and what was going on at the time. Because when you read the scriptures, the way we read them and the way we see it, so when we say the word carpenter, that's the way it translates in English, but it's very different. And there are many words that are that way, that when you look at them in the original, whether it's Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, or whatever it is, when you look at it in those ways, it can be very different than what we understand it. And that's why it's important. I really feel strongly about going back and looking at the root of it to find out what it is. So I hope you've been enjoying that as we've been doing that. All right. Well, let's see, next week we're going to be looking more at Passover and getting ready for Passover. I wanted to focus on Jesus this week so that we could understand what was going on at the time. And Passover is coming up before too long. It's coming up very quickly, actually. So we're going to be looking more at those things. We've looked at how many times they went to how many times they had to go to Jerusalem. We're going to be looking at chametz, getting the leaven out of the home. We're going to be looking at some things like that of how Jews prepared. And one of the things I've talked about how we prepared today for Passover, but I actually got that we need to look at how they prepared at the time. So when they had the Last Supper, next week we're going to talk about the Last Supper. So when they were preparing for the Last Supper, what did they have to do in that time? It's a little bit different than what we do today, but it's very similar. There's a lot of similarities, and there's some of the rules still apply about getting rid of all the leaven. So we're going to be talking about the Last Supper next week and how how it would have been for Jesus and the disciples, what it would look like. Just as like today we looked at what their normal life was like, the daily life. So I hope this has been helpful, and I hope to see you the next week on that. And I don't see any closing questions or comments. So, one more. Were the tax collectors receiving a salary from the Romans, or did they get paid by taking money from the people? They technically did get, and from everything I've seen, and I will double check it, but everything I've seen, they actually did get some payment. But yeah, it was very common. They weren't supposed to be taking money. They were getting a stipend for doing this, and they weren't supposed to be taking money from this. But even Rome knew they were doing it and allowed it because it kept people in line and they got information from them. But yes, they were getting paid to do this job. So I hope that answers that question. So yeah, they were double dipping is what I would call it. They were getting paid, and yet they were also taking money out. And like I said, Rome didn't care as long as they got their share. So as long as you gave the 2 shekels that I mentioned, what I don't know what it really was, but as long as you gave the Rome what Rome wanted, then they didn't care if you took more money out. So that's why they were doing it. And we have another tax collector in the scriptures who talks about that he was an overseer of the tax collectors and knew they were doing this and turned a blind eye to it. And so he's having to pay back. So there is, I know that there's a story about that as well. So, all right. Well, as I said, there's a lot of different lessons this week, a lot of different meetings. So I hope to see you at some of those, and definitely hope to see you at the Sabbath service next week. And like I said, next Sunday, again, we're going to be talking about the Last Supper and how that would have looked in Jesus' time and how it would have felt, and the furniture, the way what they ate, that kind of thing. We're going to be looking at that to give us an idea of, as we go into Passover season, to give us a better idea of what it would have been like for them. So I hope to see you there. And let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for allowing us to learn about your Son. Oh, Yeshua, all the things you've done for us. And you, while you came to earth and you had to live a human life and do the things, you are so wonderful and so special. And we honor and glorify you for all that you've done. You are an amazing person. You are amazing. And we just thank you for that. There's no words to describe how wonderful you are, and we thank you for that. Thank you for letting us get just a glimpse into what your life would have been like here while you were on earth. Thank you so much for that, Lord. And Lord, we ask that you break any soul ties that we may have formed in this meeting with each other. We only want to be holy unto you. We want to remain holy unto you and to continue to learn and to grow with you and learn more and more about you. We thank you for all that you've done for us. In your precious, precious name. Amen. Shalom, everyone. I hope to see you next Sunday. Bye, everyone.